Hey guys, this is Navanad. This video is, this video and the next video are called Range Utopia pre-flop, and the next will be Range Utopia post-flop. And these videos are talking about this idea, this term that I coined in the Silver Bullet series called range efficiency. But I'm pulling these concepts out of the Silver Bullet series and making a couple of videos that just really focus on specifically these concepts. This idea of range efficiency is a very important idea, and I personally am convinced that it may well make the bulk of the difference between just kind of a good mid-stakes winning player and a top-tier player. I call this video and the next video Range Utopia, because this is a reference to this idea of a utopian society. If you're not familiar with the idea, a utopian society is a society that's kind of perfect. It's a society that exists, it's a civilization that exists in perfect harmony, where every person has the perfect job for them. They have a job that they're well suited to do and perfectly happy to do. So that creates, well, hypothetically, that creates this harmony where the community is working at a maximum level of efficiency and a minimum level of waste. So that's the idea. Now, I don't know that this is something we can obtain in human civilization, but I do think it's something worth striving for within your poker game, within your no-limit hold'em range construction. So that's the idea. And when you're thinking in terms of range efficiency or even range utopia, the two memes that ought to come to mind: number one, a place for everything and everything in its place. Number two, waste not, want not. Those are the two hallmarks of efficiency, and I think efficiency is the hallmark of well-constructed ranges. So at every decision point that you find yourself in during a poker session, you ought to be asking yourself, what does my range look like here? So when under the gun opens and everybody folds to you on the button, you ought to already know what hands you're going to play. And when you peek down at your hole cards, you really need to already have the answer, or ideally you'll already have the answer to this, but we'll back up and just say you're learning and you don't know. But you need to ask yourself, what does my continuing range look like at this particular decision point, and does this hand fit into it? And if this hand does fit into my continuing range, how should I use this hand? How can I use this hand to really get the maximum benefit out of this hand? And also, you should be taking into consideration what effect this action is going to have with this hand on your overall strategy on kind of a macro level, thinking in long-term EV. So, like if I'm going to be 3-betting this hand, what hands am I flat calling? If I'm going to be flat calling this hand, what hands am I 3-betting? These are the kinds of questions you need to be asking yourself when you're trying to construct efficient ranges. Just keep in mind, starting hands, any starting hand that you play, and any starting hand that any, say, professional player plays, there's a reason that they're playing that hand from that position. And there's only a limited number of reasons that they could choose, or you could choose, to play a hand that make the hand profitable to play. And if we can break those down and really get our minds around them and understand why these factors make the hands profitable, not only will it help us know which hands to play, but it ought to help us to understand how we should play them, how to best squeeze every dime, every nickel, every penny out of every decision. So there's if you haven't seen my videos, my Silver Bullet series where I talk about things like range efficiency, this will be new, and if you have, then it'll be a little bit more than a review, because I'm going to go a little bit deeper and more specifically focused on these ideas here. Number one is domination, number two is nut potential, number three is synergy, and you can call synergy connectivity, and number four is showdown value. Those are the primary reasons. Those are the primary factors that go into whether you should even play a hand or not. And if you understand how these primary factors make you money, then you ought to have a pretty good idea then of how you ought to be playing each part of your range based on its domination, nut potential, showdown value, and synergy or connectivity. So domination refers to a hand's ability to flop really good while your opponent flops a good second best hand. So hands that have a high domination rating are going to be your big pocket pairs and your big ace X, and maybe to a lesser degree hands like king queen, because, well, yeah, I mean, depending on who your opponents are and what the positions are, hands like king jack might even have some domination to them. They might have a relatively okay domination rating. The idea is, if you start with pocket aces and you open raise, and your opponent calls with ace king or king queen or king jack suited, and they flop top pair, then you're going to have a pretty good chance of getting 3 streets of value, and if you're in position, a very good chance of getting 3 streets of value paid off here, because you've made the best hand while your opponent's made a good second best hand. And big pots in no limit hold'em are most often won or lost when both players think they've got the best hand. So if you're playing hands that have high domination ratings and good nut potential, then you're most often going to be the player who actually does have the best hand when 2 or more players believe they have the best hand. So your domination rating is very important, or your understanding of domination is very important, and it's going to influence the way that you decide to play each part of your range. Hands with high domination ratings ought to be part of your raising range more often than they're part of your calling range, because exactly the hands that will tend to call a 3-bet or call an open raise, those are the hands that you dominate with hands like ace king. In other words, if you're playing 2-5 at the local casino and you want to have an open limping range, which I don't, but I know good players that do, ace king probably shouldn't be in your open limping range, because the hands that will limp along with you are probably the hands you don't really want to play against, because those are the hands that you don't dominate. Whereas if you open raise with ace king, the hands like king queen and ace queen and king jack suited that will likely call an open raise, those are the hands you have in the worst shape, because you're going to beat them the most often, because they just don't have as much, they're not as live, they're not drawing very live against you. But even more than that, when you both flop top pair, but you've got top pair top kicker and they've got top pair second kicker, they're in a lot of trouble. They're going to lose 2 or 3 streets most of the time in that scenario. One way to look at it is these hands that have a high domination rating, like queens plus and ace king, maybe ace queen, depending on the positions, maybe even like king queen, depending on your opponents and the exact situation, but I'm sure you get the idea. But these hands are not only going to win quite frequently at showdown or before showdown, but you're going to have at least a moderate level or a pretty decent level of implied odds, because your opponent is going to have to pay off bets. That's what really implied odds means. Nut potential is another reason we decide to play some hands but not other hands. Now, hands with high nut potential, the nut potential part of the hand doesn't refer to how often they win at showdown, as much as they refer to how sure you can be that they're going to win a showdown once you connect in the way that you were hoping to connect in. So, for instance, if you play a hand like pocket sixes and you flop a set, pocket pairs have good nut potential. And this doesn't necessarily mean that they're flopping the literal nuts, like the actual best hand possible, but it more refers to the fact that they're going to not infrequently flop a hand that you're going to feel perfectly comfortable getting 100 big blinds in, by the river anyway. So nut potential doesn't really refer to robust showdown value where you're going to win the pot super often. But what it refers to is the confidence at which you can try to get stacks in when you do hit the way that you want to hit. So when you flop a set of sixes on King 6-4 Rainbow in a heads up, or even if you go 2 or 3 ways to the flop, or 3 or 4 ways to the flop, when you flop that middle set and you're sitting on a 100 big blind stack, you can be pretty comfortable and pretty confident in getting your stack in, because just like the hands that have a good domination rating are going to be able to make great winning hands when their opponents make good second best hands, well, this is like a level above that, where even a player that's holding pocket aces or ace king, when that King 6 Deuce Rainbow flop comes down, those players are going to think that they've got the best hand, and they're even going to realize and understand probably that you might have a hand that you think is the best hand, but is actually a good second best hand. So you're kind of going one level up, so you don't have moderate implied odds, you've got really extreme implied odds, where you can not only beat the hands that make good second best hands against dominated hands, but you can also beat the hands that dominate those hands. So it puts you in a great situation. Anytime that you can flop the nuts against a player who has a good second best hand, there's a tremendous amount of value in that. So domination, nut potential, these are 2 reasons that we play certain starting hands. Some other considerations are showdown value and synergy. Synergy can also be thought of as connectivity, and what we mean by that is how well the 2 cards that are in the 2-card starting hand work together. 9-8 suited, for instance, is a very good example of a high synergy hand. It's going to be able to hit a lot of flops in a lot of different ways. You can flop like a combo draw, and depending on your opponent, there's lots of different profitable lines that you can play. They're good hands to have in the mix for board coverage. They'll help you with your board coverage. They'll allow you to take some creative out-of-the-box lines. And the nice thing about playing suited connectors, or hands like Ace-2 suited through Ace-5 suited, which are also highly synergistic hands, or your suited broadways also have a lot of good synergy. Like your Queen-Jack suited has high synergy. King-Queen suited has pretty good synergy. Those hands are going to flop. They're going to hit flops in certain ways that allow you to best take advantage of every player, or each individual player's specific weaknesses. For instance, if we flop the nut flush draw against a total calling station that sizes his bets very small, who is the pre-flop raiser, we can check and call because he's giving us a great price to draw, and we can, if we're playing against this small bet sizing, weak passive player who doesn't know how to fold a hand, then we can check and call against this guy because he's going to give us great odds, and we'll have fantastic implied odds when we actually get there, when we hit our draw and we make the nut flush, and we might be able to stack this guy and we can draw at a good price. But if we're playing that same exact situation, that same exact hand, against a player who's tight and aggressive and sees monsters under every bed, then when we flop the nut flush draw with an overcard with our Ace-5 suited, and we check and he continuation bets, maybe we raise him. So, and he just folds because that's what he does, right? He folds to raises. So having the connectivity or synergistic hands will, one of the nicest things about that is it's going to allow us to tailor our strategy for our specific opponent in this one hand, where normally adjustments to your strategy need to be made on a much broader level against your opponents. These hands have this built-in ability to allow you to play in different ways, especially when you've got deep stacks and you've got a lot of room to maneuver. The other factor, the other primary factor, is showdown value. And showdown value is the reason that even though, let's say you open raise pocket nines and a very tight player 3-bets you, and maybe you don't quite have the right implied odds to set mine him, the kind of intrinsic built-in showdown value that a pair of nines has may allow you to make that call when you'd have to fold something like pocket 2s or 3s, because some of the time you'll be able to get that hand to showdown and win the pot unimproved. So most of your big ace-x hands and your medium to big pocket pairs are going to have this kind of built-in showdown value that's going to allow you to call a little bit more liberally than you might otherwise be able to call, because of the times where you'll be able to just check the hand down, go to showdown, and win a small pot. So those are your primary factors. Secondary factors that you need to consider, or you ought to consider when you're constructing ranges, are utility, board coverage, blockers, and this is kind of I don't want to say a hodgepodge way to think, but it's these three factors. They're not primary factors in and of themselves because they're not as important as the other factors, and they aren't as clean. They're not as crisp examples of kind of, quote, hand anatomy, end quote. Because, well, for instance, utility. Utility is not itself a factor as much as it's a combination of the primary factors. So when we talk about utility, when I talk about utility, a hand like King Queen suited is a very good example of a hand that has a high utility. And its utility is going to allow you to, say, play it from early position at a full ring game. And that's because with a hand like King Queen suited, if you open raise and you're called just by the big blind, the hand plays very well heads up because of its high card value and its domination rating against the big blind's calling range. And if you open raise it from under the gun and get called by 3 opponents, you're not in that big of trouble there either, because it does have utility. It's also got suited connectivity where it can flop, like 2 overcards with a draw to the second nut flush, or it can, just outright hit the nut straight, or you can be drawing to Broadway and have a backdoor flush draw and 2 overcards. So it plays well in a lot of different situations, which allows you to play the hand in different ways depending on the table composition, your position, and where your opponents are relative to where you are. Board coverage, it is a consideration, but it's not exactly a fundamental factor. It is kind of like a secondary factor in specifically range construction. And I'm going to give you an example here of where board coverage can come in when you're constructing a range. Let's say that you're playing against very good players that know your game, and they've kind of caught on to the fact that you're a complete nit from under the gun. And again, just using the example of a 2-5 live casino game. Say you're there, 6 days a week, 5 days a week, but you're there very often during the week playing against other regulars, and they know that when you open raise under the gun, you've got a big hand. And so when you're opening from under the gun and you get called by one player and the flop comes out ace, queen, 6, rainbow, you're going to have a hard time getting value with your continuation bets because you just never have air if you're opening a super tight range from under the gun, because you're going to have a bunch of big aces, and you're just not going to have hands that are bluffing, outright bluffing on this board. Now you may have hands like pocket 10s and pocket 8s and pocket kings that you may want to turn them into bluffs, but the reason you'd be betting them and turning them into bluffs is really because you don't have enough better hands in your range to use as bluffs. So when you're thinking about board coverage, when you're constructing your ranges, you might want to take some hands like ace-x suiteds that break about even from under the gun, and suited connectors like 7-6 suited that might break about even, playing them under the gun against good, decent opponents. But the reason you're including them is because they add value to your overall strategy. For instance, if you have 7-6 suited and 8-7 suited, maybe a couple ace-2 through ace-5 combos that are suited in your range, well, when you open from under the gun and that flop comes out ace-queen 5 rainbow, or ace-queen 6 rainbow, whatever it is, now all of a sudden you've got some hands that want to bluff this flop. So you have 8-7 suited here, and you can make your continuation bet, and your opponent folds, thinking you just always have it here. And the other end of that coin, the other side of that coin is, if you're opening from under the gun into a table full of pretty good players, or even just a couple of good players, but one of the good players is the guy that calls you, if the flop comes out 4, 5, 8, or 4, 5, 9, or 6, 7, 8, or 7, 8, 9, or 8, 9, 10, when you continue, you're going to be in a bad spot against a guy that knows that you play a super tight range from under the gun, and he's called you in position, especially, and especially if you're pretty deep, because if you don't have hands like 7-6 suited and 8-7 suited and etc. In your range, then when that flop comes out with small or medium cards on it, your opponent knows that you don't have much of that in your range, or maybe you don't have any of that at all in your range if you're not opening all of your pairs from under the gun either. So the inclusion of hands like 9-8 suited, 8-7 suited in your range from under the gun gives you better board coverage that allows you to fight back or put up a fight or actually have a hand when the flop comes out 7, 8, 9. If you've got Jack 10 suited in your under the gun range, now you've got the nuts. You have the nut. You at least have the potential to have the nuts. I don't mean you've got the nuts. I just mean you've got the nuts in your range. Or when the board comes out 3, 4, 5, if you've got 7-6 suited, if your opponent doesn't believe you've got that in your range, then you're going to make a ton of money the times where you actually do have that hand. When you show up with a hand that he doesn't think you can have, and he tries to put a bunch of pressure on you, and you stack it, right? So the effect of having good board coverage and considering good board coverage when you're constructing your ranges is a dual effect. It's a double effect. Number one, it allows you to rep a strong hand on, well, actually it's more than a double. It's got a lot of ways in which it helps you, because it can allow you to represent a big hand on boards like 8-7-6 or 7-6-5. So that's one way that it helps you, is you can rep a big hand on boards that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. Number two, you'll have hands that can bluff on ace, queen, 6 type boards. And if you don't have any hands that are bluffing on that flop, then you're obviously doing something wrong. So you'll be able to leverage your range advantage when you don't actually have a hand, when your range looks very strong. You'll be able to bluff boards that you otherwise would not be able to bluff, because you can rep some hands that you have in your range now that if you weren't considering board coverage might not be in your range. If your opponent is not on to the fact that you've got these hands in your range, and you actually flop a monster hand on a small board that looks like it doesn't hit your range at all, then you may well stack him. So there's a lot of ways in which board coverage can help you. I'm not advocating that you start playing break-even hands against a bunch of fish that you rarely play against, but if you're playing with the same people over and over, and you have to worry about things like balance, if you're having to worry about things like balance, you probably ought to be worrying about things like board coverage also. And if you're planning on moving up stakes and becoming, like a professional poker player, then you definitely need to at least be aware that this is a concept that exists. And blocker effects. Now, blocker effects are going to relate mostly to 3-betting and 4-betting ranges. But it's just the idea that if I have ace-5 suited in a spot where ace-5 suited is too weak to call with, maybe I can 3-bet ace-5 suited, because it makes it less likely that my opponent holds pocket aces or ace-king or ace-queen, or a hand that he could fight back with. So it isn't a primary, but it is a secondary factor. And these secondary factors are just that. They're either not as important as the primary factors, or there's some combination of the primary factors, or they relate only loosely to the actual EV, or they, not loosely, but indirectly to the actual EV of a hand. You spent way too much time on that slide. Let's go. Okay, so how do we use each part of our range pre-flop? And here's the example. we're facing a middle position limp. And I want to just stick with the example that we're playing live, but you could be playing small stakes or micro stakes online, 9-handed or even 6 max, and all of this would apply. And you will see limping, or even a tournament like a multi-table tournament. You'll see a ton of this if you play like I play on Bovada. If you play a $20 or even like $50 multi-table tournament, you will see open limping at lots of different blind levels. So, and if you play micro stakes, you know that this is something that does happen. So, and if you play at the casinos, you know that this happens all the time. So, for this example, middle position open limps. So, villain has a limping range that's bound and capped. That means that he's not limping utter trash. That's what we mean by bound. And he's not limping any of his big value hands. That's what we mean by capped. So his range is capped, but it's also bound. It's value merged. It's like a merged range. It's not at all polarized. It's the opposite of polarized. It mostly consists of suited connectors, small pocket pairs, suited aces, and some of the double broadways like your Jack 10, Queen 10, King 10, especially suited broadways that aren't strong enough to open raise. So that's opponent. That's a villain's range. He open limps. Now hero, that's you. If you have ace-king on the button, what's your play? And why? Okay, so I would assume that your play is to raise against the limper. You want to isolate here. If you were on the cutoff, it would be the same thing, maybe more important to ISO. So when we isolate, why are we isolating? Well, the answer is because, well, we have immediate fold equity. But most of the time when a player limps and you ISO, he calls. I mean, I would say, especially live, I would say at least better than half of the time he calls. So you're scooping up dead money when he doesn't call, and with a hand like ace-king on the button, you're in position, and you've got a hand that flops frequent strength. Also, you're going to dominate some of the hands that this guy chooses to limp in with. He may open limp ace-5 suited, you isolate with ace-king, he calls, and the flop comes with an ace, and we've already talked about the trouble that he's in when that happens. So when you have a hand that has a high domination factor, you should favor raising. That should give you incentive. It should incentivize you to add it to your open raising, 3-betting, or isolating range. Now let's say you have pocket 3s on the button. Same situation. The same villain open limps middle position, and you've got pocket 3s. What should you do? It's debatable, and it does depend somewhat on the villain, but most of the time I think you should go ahead and over limp here. We're on the button, we know we're going to be acting last post-flop, and we have a hand that while it doesn't flop frequent strength, and it doesn't have pretty good implied odds pretty often, it's one of these hands that has very good nut potential. What do we want to do with hands that have very good nut potential? Well, hands with very good nut potential, you ought to look at kind of like you're fishing. You're putting in a little bit of bait, hoping to, every once in a while, occasionally land the big whopper, the big fish, right? You're going to throw out a little bit of bait, and every once in a while you're going to reel in the fish. You're going to stack some dude that can't get away from top pair, or 2-pair, or whatever the case, and draw. So when you have a hand that relies heavily on implied odds for its profitability, you are only cutting your own implied odds down when you put money into the pot before the flop comes out that you don't need to put in. Now, I'm not suggesting necessarily that you open limp these hands, but what I am saying is you can certainly over limp these hands in late position, especially on the button. Another thing is, since we have pocket 3s here instead of ace-king, we have a hand that's going to play pretty well multi-way rather than just playing really well heads up. And that's because the frequency in which you win the pot is going to be almost the same whether, well, okay, I should rephrase that. The frequency in which you're going to flop a set is going to be identical whether there's one opponent or 3 opponents. And when you do flop a set, you will be almost as likely to beat all 3 of them as you will just one opponent heads up, but you'll have many more sources of income. So we'll have more customers in there, more chances for somebody to flop a really good second best hand that can pay you a lot of money. and you might even get multiple people to put money in on one or two streets, and you may end up stacking one of them. The more opponents you've got in against you when you're set mining, the more profitable. That's because, again, it's not going to reduce the number of times you hit a set. And when you flop a set, you're almost as likely to beat two opponents as you are to beat one opponent. But you might be something like twice as likely to stack somebody. And you might make something like twice as much money on average when you do flop a set. So for that reason, you don't have a lot of incentive to push anybody out. Your hand plays better in a big stack-to-pot ratio rather than a small stack-to-pot ratio. And you want to invest a small amount hoping to win a big amount. What about 9-8 suited on the button? Same scenario. Middle position limp, 9-8 suited on the button. Well, this is a hand that has what going for it? Synergy. It's got a lot of connectivity. So the connectivity and the synergy, what makes them profitable to play? Well, it's the way that you can customize the lines. It's the way that you can get creative. It's the many ways in which you can hit flops that makes these hands particularly profitable. So this is another situation where I favor over-limping, and this is a hand that has that same kind of thing going for it as pocket threes, that when you hit, now not quite to the same degree, because here when you have 9-8 suited against three players, you are going to have to worry somewhat about reverse implied odds, because you can make a second best flush much more easily with three opponents as one. But be that as it may, even still, I think that the correct answer is usually going to be to over-limp these hands that are not going to flop frequent strength, but are going to hit big or hit in sneaky, unexpected ways when they do hit. And the less money we put in pre-flop, the smaller the pot is, the more room we have to play the hand in whichever way we think is best based on our opponents and however we actually hit the flop. So 9-8 suited on the button, I don't think we've got as much incentive to push players out as ace-king. We may have a little more incentive for people to go away than we do with pocket threes, but even still, I'm over-limping this, and I feel pretty confident telling you that's the right play. King 10 offsuit or King 10 suited in the small blind versus a limp for middle position. I think, and this is why I didn't put King 10 suited or King 10 offsuit, I feel like King 10 offsuit in the small blind is an ISO. I think we want to raise that, and we want to play the hand for its frequent strength. We want to play the hand for the fact that we can isolate hands like 10-9, 10-8 suited, King 9, King 8 suited, and if we're in the same 2-5 cash game, and you may find a guy in there messing around with King 6 suited or even King deuce suited. It's not unheard of. So I think in this situation, if it's offsuit, we should ISO raise, and we should look to play our hand as a hand that flops good frequent strength, where we're going to hit top pair with a reasonable kicker pretty often. Or, the other thing is when you do ISO and your opponent does call, you're going to take the pot down with a continuation bet post flop a high percent of the time anyway. Now, if it's a King 10 suited and you're in the small blind, now I can really get behind just completing, because now our hand is going to have a lot more ways to hit flops, and it's going to have ways that it can improve to beat multiple opponents. So the implied odds are starting to look more attractive to me when the hand is suited than when it's an offsuit version of the same hand. King Queen, I would say suited or offsuit, we should isolate with this hand, because there are so many hands that villains will open limp and then call an ISO with that we have dominated. So even if we have King Queen suited, I still think that we want to play this hand for its domination factor, for its domination rating. We want to isolate, we want to raise big, build a pot, and hopefully catch a guy in there with Queen Jack suited, King 10 suited, King Jack offsuit, Queen 10 suited, Queen 9 suited, whatever he's limping in with. You're going to dominate so much of his limp call range that I think isolating is the only correct answer here, and hopefully you can see the difference between these two hands. Mainly, King-Queen just dominates so many more hands than King-10, even when they're both suited, or I guess that goes without saying. So we want to play it more for its domination rating. Ace-9 suited in the big blind. If we face this middle position limp, small blind folds. I think we need to ISO our ace-9 suited, even though we've got implied odds. I think that ace-10 suited usually open raises middle position if it's going to play. So most of the ace-x suited in our opponent's range we will dominate. So because we've got this good domination rating, not great, but against the limp call range, and also because hands like Jack-9 suited, 10-9 suited, 9-8 suited, 9-7 suited may be in that range, and they may limp and then call a raise. We're going to dominate enough hands that I think we can isolate, and we're going to build some fold. We're going to build a pot that we're going to be able to take down with a continuation bet often enough against a guy that's, you know, open limping and then just calling a raise. That I think that is the preferred play. Jack-10 offsuit, Jack-10 suited in the big blind. If middle position open limps, everybody else folds, including the small blind. I think Jack-10 is a hand that if it is suited or offsuit, I'm just gonna knock the table and take a look at a flop either way, because I want to look at this hand not so much for its domination rating, but more for its implied odds and the infinite pot odds that I'm getting to see the flop here. Okay, so Jack-10 is different than King-10 because it simply doesn't dominate nearly as many hands, right? So even Jack-10 offsuit, if a guy limps and then we ISO raise, if we go for the ISO and the guy calls, we might be dominated. Queen-10 has us dominated. Queen-Jack has us dominated. If ace-10 suited decided to limp in, which, may be the case sometimes, or king-10 suited might be more likely. So we're just dominated by too many hands in the villain's open limping range, if he has an open limping range from middle position, that I'm completely turned off to the idea of trying to isolate this out of position. So hopefully, my goal here was to help you kind of build up some intuition on what hands are good for ISOing or raising and what hands are good for overlimping. So I'm not going to get into this too much. I think you should read this, and if you have questions, post them. But we'll read this. Let's take a look at it. If hero is in position versus an open limper, how do we construct our isolation range? How do we construct our overlimping range? Now, we just talked about this with examples. Maybe we should have done that in another order, but maybe not. Maybe so I'm asking you, if you're in position, we have an open limper in middle position, how do we construct our ISO range? So what hands are we raising with and why? Now, how do we construct our overlimping range? What hands are we just completing the small blind with? We're in position. What hands are we just flicking the one big blind in from the button and trying to take a look at a flop? Now, in this example here, hero is in position versus an open raise. Now, how do we construct our flatting range and how do we construct our three-betting range? Now, maybe, hopefully, the ideas that we were just talking about will give you some insight, and hopefully you've built some intuition. Again, that's the idea, is to help you build intuition about these spots. Remember the four factors. Things like domination favor being aggressive. So we want to construct our three-betting range with hands that are going to, the value part of our three-bet range, we want to construct that with hands that once they raise and get called, they dominate a big chunk of our opponent's calling range. And I think that if we're in position, we probably want to polarize our range against good players, because good players are likely to not call three bets out of position. And if our opponent's only going to four bet or fold, then we need to polarize our range, because if we three bet a hand like King Jack suited from the button against a good competent regular who open raises from middle position or cutoff, once we three bet that hand, we've essentially wasted the value of it. We've got blockers to jacks, kings, ace king, ace jack, which may or may not continue. So we do have some blockers, and that's good. So we block some of his value range. But we are kind of wasting the value of our hand if we decide to 3-bet that hand, because if our opponent is never going to flat call, then if he folds it, it doesn't really matter what hand we have, and we may as well have used a hand like ace-2 suited that has the ace blocker, which is probably better than having the king and the jack both. And if we do happen to get flat called, we've got a suited ace which will play reasonably well. But most good players will not flat call 3-bets out of position because it's not profitable to do that. I'm going to recommend to you that you stop doing it. Don't flat call 3-bets out of position. Do not get in the habit of doing that. Mostly you should be 4-betting or folding if you're out of position facing a 3-bet from a player who's in position. So if we know that our opponent is never going to flat us, then we need to polarize our range. We need to use the tip top of our continuing range and the bottom of our continuing range. So we need to balance with some bluffs, like some ace-2 suited through ace-5 suited, and maybe some hands like king-9 suited. Use hands that have blockers that are suited, because we're not going to 3-bet every hand that has a blocker. We may as well pick the suited ones. We're not going to pick all suited kings, so we may as well use the ones that have the highest kickers where we're unwilling to flat call. And we need to take the middle of our range and just flat it and take flops in position with what will often be the best hand. Now, if hero is out of position versus an open limp, how do we construct our raising range? It's pretty much the same in position as out of position when it comes to limping. But when hero is out of position versus an open raise, now how do we construct our flatting range? And how do we construct our 3-betting range, I should say? This is not a time to polarize. Good players will call your 3-bets in position and take flops. So if we know we're going to get flat called a very non-0% of the time, then we need to have a pretty strong range that's going to flop pretty well. So when we're out of position facing an open raise, the best way to utilize the most hands possible profitably is, because we're out of position, we're not going to have some of the luxuries that we have when we're in position. We're not going to have the luxury of being able to flat a ton of hands profitably, and we're not going to have the luxury of being able to 3-bet some junk just because it's got some blockers, because we're just going to get flat called too often. What we don't want to do is 3-bet king-7 suited and get flat called by the button. That's not good. So we're just going to take some bottom level hand, like we're just going to take our entire range. We're going to say, okay, this hand right here, let's call it king-jack offsuit, king-10 suited. These are going to be the very worst hands I'm going to continue with. And we 3-bet them. That's it. So when we're facing a late position open raise, then we may not even want to have a flat calling range from the blinds. And I would say, unless you're very advanced and a high-level poker player, I would suggest that you don't have a flat calling range from the blinds versus attempts to steal. So in conclusion, using our hands to do exactly what that part of our range is best at is going to allow us the maximum number of hands to make profit with. That's huge. That's very important. We're not wasting anything. We're using everything. And constructing our ranges with efficiency in mind will help the different hands inside the range work well together. This concept is just as true post-flop as it is pre-flop. And the next video I do is going to be Range Utopia for post-flop poker. So as always, guys, feel free to leave questions or comments. I hope you enjoyed the video and it wasn't too long, dry, boring, etc. Until next time, Navana, good luck.